Okay, let us now look at our complex spline settings category. And we'll just enable complex rendering by clicking this checkbox here. The first property in this category is spacing. Spacing is the distance at which the spline mesh is repeated along the spline. I chose 39 units here as the default because the cube mesh which I'm rendering is 39 units wide. So we went over spacing. We'll go over tangent scale a little bit later in the video because I'll have to create a whole new spline using a different mesh to illustrate how tangent scale affects the spline. We'll go over debug information later in the video. Now let's go into spline point data. So in spline point data we have a default spline point type. We can change this to any of these options: curve, constant, curve, clamped. For right now we'll change it to curve. So let's just change it real quickly. Choose curve. And now we have to empty out our spline point type array because right now it has all the old values of our default spline point type. So just simply hit the trash can. Now the array is recreated and updated with our new default. So we finally gotten to the point in our video to just show the debug information panel. Our first option in the debug information panel is draw spline point numbers. What this does is draw numbers over the intersections of the spline meshes. So just turn it on to illustrate. As you can see, 0 starting at the end, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and there's 9 right there. You just move it out a little bit to demonstrate that. As you can see, 9. Now since I'm using the complex type, you got to remember that it creates a spline mesh at certain distances along the spline and not at the spline points. If I choose the use simple spline technique, you'll see the numbers are actually above the spline points, which is correct. I'll just switch that back. So that's our first little helper tool in our debug panel. Secondly is the draw spline up direction. And what it does is draw the spline up direction at each point in the spline. So this kind of brings in to what I mentioned at the beginning of the video for spline up direction. And I've actually exposed this so it's a simple widget on the spline that you can manipulate. And as you can see, if I click it, this simple little widget, I can actually move the spline up direction and it's updated appropriately. Now why is the spline up direction so important? Well, it's important if you get into splines that have loops, or in fact let's demonstrate it right here. Let's just hold Alt, pull this point. What you will notice is this point begins to twist as it follows the spline up direction. This is because the spline up direction is supposed to be perpendicular to the spline, and it's not. Instead, it's parallel to the spline here. As you can see, if I go in very slowly, you can see the arrows following the spline upward. This is bad, and I made the spline up arrows in the middle of the spline so that whenever you can't see them, that's generally a bad thing. You always want to be able to see the arrows. Now to fix this, all I have to do is grab my spline up direction and move it so that my spline up direction is now perpendicular to the actual spline and no arrows are embedded inside of the spline mesh. And as you can see, it's a little rough transition, but there is no twisting. Now let's just turn that off and turn this spline point numbers back on. I also included some simple little variables here to allow the display of these numbers to be a little bit cleaner. So we can adjust the size of the numbers to make them really big or really small. It's just a little bit easier to see them along here. Or you can change the distance the numbers are away from the actual spline, which is, bring it down real low, we'll see that all the spline numbers correspond to the spline mesh on the spline.